You're in the wrong room. Don't move! Lyra, it's already awake.
What did you do to me?
We did nothing. The Bond chose you. And the station just answered it. What's on the other side?
Nothing should be alive out there.
It wasn't alive. Until you woke it.
The shower on level 3 of Solus Deep Relay's station had one working drain, 2 temperature settings that could generously be described as punishing and freezing, and a door latch that Callum Ward had submitted a maintenance request for 13 weeks ago. He had stopped expecting anyone to read it. The station itself was old infrastructure, 3rd rotation survey class, the kind the Interstellar Cartographic Authority liked to park at the outer boundary of mapped space and staff with a skeleton crew of automated systems, a fleet of survey drones, and one human technician whose entire purpose was to keep things from falling apart before the quarterly resupply ship showed up. It was not glamorous work. It was not the kind of work that got mentioned at authority dinners or written up in the annual review. It was the kind of work that existed because someone had to do it, and Callum had volunteered. And that was that. He had been doing the job for 9 months. Before him, it had been a woman named Dara, who had left a handwritten note stuck to the side of the coffee unit with adhesive tape that was already peeling at the corners. When he arrived, the note said, "Shower on L3 has no latch. Knock the frame twice before entering. Trust me on this." He had read the note. He had appreciated the note. He had followed the instructions on the note every single morning for 9 months without a problem, because the station was staffed by exactly one person, and that person was him. And there was nobody on the other side of the door to worry about. 9 months of knocking on a door frame out of habit, alone at the edge of charted space, talking to nobody but the resupply coordinator on a twice-monthly comm link and the automated diagnostic system that occasionally informed him, in a flat synthetic voice, that something else had broken. He was not unhappy. He wanted to be clear about that, even to himself. He was not a person who needed a great deal from his environment. He needed the work to make sense, and it did. He needed the systems to respond when he fixed them, and they did. He needed the coffee unit to function, and it mostly did, except on Wednesdays when it produced something closer to warm brown water than actual coffee. For reasons he had never been able to diagnose, he could live with that. He had been living with it. The Cavern delegation arrived on a Thursday. He had known they were coming. The authorities' message had arrived 2 weeks prior. Transmit through the standard comm, relay with the standard formatting, and the standard bureaucratic tone that made everything sound like it had been written by a committee, which it probably had. 2 survey officers from the Venari Scientific Directorate will be joining Solus Station for a 40-day assessment period. Their role is primarily observational. They will be reviewing the station's geological and atmospheric data archives, cataloging mineral composition scans from sectors 9 through 15, and preparing a co-authored assessment for the Outer Belt Expansion Review Board. A second paragraph, in what felt like a different voice, had added, "Please ensure adequate provisioning for 2 additional occupants. Venari dietary requirements have been forwarded to your automated food systems. Confirm receipt." Callum had confirmed receipt. He had checked the bunk assignments in the guest quarters on level 2, which had not been used since Dara left, and smelled faintly of recycled air and disuse. He ran the deep clean protocol. He tested the food units with the Venari dietary profile loaded and watched them produce a dense protein block that looked vaguely like compressed chalk and smelled like wet stone, and he decided not to taste it. He restocked the water recycler filters. He cleaned the survey room terminals and loaded the relevant sector data. He had also intended to fix the shower latch before they arrived. He did not fix the shower latch before they arrived. It was one of those tasks that kept sliding down the priority list, not because it was difficult, but because it was easy. Easy enough that it felt like something he could do tomorrow, and then tomorrow had its own problems. A pressure fault in the water reclamation line, a drone that came back with a cracked sensor housing, the atmospheric relay on the outer ring throwing error codes that turned out to be a loose connector and nothing more. Real problems. The latch was not a real problem. It was an inconvenience that only affected him, and he had learned to work around it, and so it stayed unfixed. The Venari officers came aboard in the late morning cycle, docking without incident in the station's single bay. Callum met them at the airlock seal because that was protocol, and because he was the station's only permanent crew member, its senior technician by default, and its sole point of contact for anyone who needed anything. He saw them before he properly understood what he was seeing. Two figures stepping through the docking seal, both wearing the pale gray field suits of the Venari Directorate, cut close and practical, with a faint sheen to the fabric that caught the bay lights, both carrying a rectangular equipment case in their left hand, both pausing at the same moment to look around the bay, a synchronized hesitation that was not quite planned, but not quite accidental either. The kind of thing two people did when they had spent long enough working in proximity that their rhythms had started to merge without either of them deciding it. The taller one turned toward him first, and he registered what he was looking at. Venari were humanoid. He knew that from the briefing files. The files had described them in clinical shorthand, the way one described his fees when they were writing for a database entry, and not for a person who was about to stand in a room with one. Humanoid bipeds, bilateral symmetry. Skin pigmentation ranges from pale silver gray to deep blue violet, bioluminescent undertone present in most populations. Hair coloration typically white or near white, eye coloration amber to deep gold. Average height comparable to human range. This was technically accurate. It was also about as useful as describing music as organized vibrations in the air. The taller sister's skin was the color of deep ocean water, smooth and faintly luminous in a way that the briefing files had called bioluminescent undertone, and that Callum would have called something closer to the way certain stones looked when you held them up to light. There was a quality to it that shifted depending on the angle, darker at the hollows of her cheeks and throat, lighter where the bay lights hit the line of her jaw and the backs of her hands. Her hair was white, not silver white, not bleached, not the white of age, the white of fresh snow, dense and clean, pulled back into a single braid that ran down the center of her back. Her eyes were gold, not the gold-flecked hazel that humans sometimes had, not an approximation, a solid, steady gold, like polished metal. And she was looking at him with an expression that he could not read at all. He suspected this was going to be a recurring issue. The shorter sister was a few inches shorter, and her skin was a shade lighter, more silver than deep blue, with the same luminous quality. Her hair was the same true white but cut differently, cropped close at the sides and left longer on top, falling in a loose sweep across her forehead. Her eyes were the same gold. The resemblance between them was the kind that sat in the bones rather than the details. The same underlying architecture arranged with a different emphasis. The way two instruments built to the same specifications could still produce different sounds. Technician Ward, the taller one, said. Her voice had a layered quality to it, two tones running almost but not quite in parallel, slightly out of phase with each other in a way that was mentioned in the briefing files and completely failed to prepare him for the actual experience of hearing it. It was not unpleasant. It was unusual in the way that an unfamiliar chord progression was unusual, something the ear needed a moment to adjust to before it could settle. I am Senior Survey Officer Sareth Kavrin, she continued. My sister, Officer Ilya Kavrin. A small, precise gesture to her right. We appreciate the accommodation. Welcome to Solus, he said, and he thought he said it smoothly enough. I will show you to your quarters. The data terminals in the survey room are preloaded with sectors 9 through 15. I can walk you through the file structure whenever you are ready. Sareth nodded. One short downward motion, efficient and complete. Her sister Ilya was still looking around the docking bay with a focused, cataloging attention that made Callum feel, briefly and not unpleasantly, like a piece of equipment she was assessing for function. He showed them to their quarters on level 2. He explained the food units and the dietary profile and the water recycler schedule. He showed them the comm system and how to reach the resupply coordinator if they needed to, though he mentioned that the coordinator was responsive about twice a month and indifferent the rest of the time. He showed them the survey room and the terminal interface and walked through the data organization, which was his own system, built over 9 months of working alone and refined to the point where he could find anything in the archive in under 30 seconds. Sareth asked 3 questions about the filing structure. All 3 were specific and useful. He answered them, and she absorbed the answers without repeating them back, which he appreciated, because it meant she was actually listening and not performing the act of listening. He was thorough. He was professional. He was the competent, steady station technician that the authority expected him to be. He did not, at any point during the tour, remember to mention the shower latch. The first week passed without problems. The Cavern sisters were, as far as Callum could tell, close to ideal station guests. They were quiet. They worked long hours. They did not interfere with his maintenance schedule, or rearrange his workshop, or leave equipment in the corridors. They used the shared spaces at predictable times. The galley in the morning, the survey room through the mid-cycle, the observation deck occasionally in the late hours. When they encountered him in one of those spaces, they were polite without being intrusive, present without being demanding. Sareth asked clear, direct questions about the data systems and the station's geological monitoring equipment, and she treated his answers with the same seriousness she would have given to a colleague in her own directorate. This was not something Callum had expected. In his experience, visiting officers from major scientific bodies tended to treat station technicians as furniture that could talk. Sareth did not do this. When he explained something about the drone calibration or the atmospheric monitoring array, she listened with her full attention. And when she followed up, her follow-up questions showed she had understood the first answer completely. Ilya was different. She appeared in the workshop sometimes while he was running diagnostics on the drone fleet, stood near the secondary workbench, watched him work in focused silence for 10 or 15 minutes, and then left without saying anything. He was not sure if this counted as conversation by Venari standards. It might have. He had no reference point. He did not ask. The thing about spending 9 months alone in deep space was that you developed a certain relationship with silence. You learned which silences were comfortable and which ones carried weight. You learned which ones needed filling and which ones would be ruined by filling. By the end of the first week, Callum had tentatively decided that the Cavern sisters understood this, and that meant they were going to get along. What he could not figure out, by the end of that first week, was the way they sometimes looked at him. It was not hostile. It was not unfriendly. It was something else. Something he kept filing under observational because that was the closest word he had. Even though it covered too much ground to be useful, he would notice Ilya watching him eat breakfast with the same focused, cataloging expression she wore when she was reading mineral composition data on her tablet, and he would wonder what exactly she was cataloging. He would catch Sareth studying his hands while he worked a repair panel, and when he looked up, she would not look away. She would simply acknowledge that she had been looking and return to whatever she had been doing, as though the act of looking had not been a thing that required explanation. Among humans, this would have been unusual enough to comment on. He had no idea what it meant among Venari. He decided it was a cultural difference and filed it in the back of his mind and moved on. It was the 9th day when the shower situation happened. He had been up since the early maintenance cycle, chasing a pressure fault in the water reclamation system that had taken 4 hours to isolate and another 2 to repair. By the time he reached the level 3 shower unit, he was exhausted, covered in the particular grime that accumulated when you spent 6 hours lying on your back under pipes that had not been properly cleaned since the station was built, and not thinking about anything other than hot water and 8 hours of sleep. He knocked the door frame twice out of habit, the flat of his hand against the metal. 2 quick strikes, the same way he had done it every morning for 9 months. He waited a beat. Silence. He pushed the door open, stripped off the work coveralls, and stepped into the shower stall. The stall had no curtain. It had never had a curtain. It was a metal box with a shower head and a drain and a temperature control with 2 settings. And the only thing between the person standing in it and the rest of the corridor was the door and its broken latch. He turned the water to the hot setting, which the station interpreted as something close to scalding, and stood under it with his eyes closed and let the heat work into his shoulders. He was about 3 minutes in when the door opened. He heard it before he understood what the sound was, the particular creak of the frame giving way, the door swinging outward on its hinge, the brief rush of corridor air that was cooler than the steam. He turned around. The Cavern sisters were standing in the doorway, both of them, together. Ilya was slightly ahead, one hand still raised toward where the door had been, her gold eyes wide. Behind her, Sareth had gone very still, her head tilted slightly forward, her expression caught in the middle of several things at once, none of which Callum could identify. They had not knocked. They had clearly not expected to find him there. For a moment, a long and genuinely strange moment, nobody moved. Callum was standing in a shower stall, with no curtain and no wall, and no door between him and the corridor, soaked, and as completely unclothed as it was possible for a human being to be. This was not a situation with any ambiguity to it. He was also, given the options available to him, going to stay calm about it, because he had already run through every possible response in the first 2 seconds and none of the alternatives improved anything. He reached behind him and shut off the water. The sudden silence was louder than the shower had been. "The latch is broken," he said. It was not an elegant thing to say. It was not even a particularly good thing to say, but it was true, and it was the first thing that came to him, and he said it in the flat, factual tone of a person making a maintenance report, rather than a person standing naked in front of 2 alien women he had known for 9 days. Neither of them turned away. He noticed this. Somewhere behind the part of his brain that was focused on the immediate logistics of the situation, another part registered that detail and held on to it. Most people, in his experience, would have looked away. It was a reflex, an automatic social redirect, the kind of thing humans did without thinking when they stumbled into a situation like this. You averted your eyes. You turned your head. You performed the small physical gesture that said, "I did not mean to see this, and I am pretending I did not see it." The Cavern sisters were not performing it. They were standing there, Ilya with her hand still half raised, Sareth behind her with that unreadable stillness, and they were looking at him the way they looked at everything, with that steady, direct attention that he had spent the past week trying to interpret. "I apologize," Ilya said. Her voice had the same dual-tone quality as her sister's, pitched slightly lower. She sounded genuinely startled, which was the first time he had heard anything other than measured calm from her. "We were not informed that the schedule indicated this unit would be in use. We did not intend to intrude." "I know," he said. "The latch has been broken for a while. I should have mentioned it." There was another beat of silence. Sareth, behind her sister, said something in Venari, 3 syllables, low and rapid, with a tonal shift in the middle that could have been a question or an instruction. Ilya answered without turning around, which meant she answered without looking away from him. Callum decided that whatever was happening here, it was going to be easier to navigate with clothes on. "If you could," he said, and made a small gesture toward the door. Just a movement of his hand that meant step back and give me a moment, and he kept his voice even and did not rush it. Ilya blinked. It was a slow, deliberate motion, not the quick flutter of a human blink, but something more controlled. The Venari equivalent of a person taking a breath and collecting themselves. She stepped back. Sareth stepped back with her. The door swung mostly shut. He dried off faster than he had ever dried off in his life, pulled on the clean coveralls he had left, folded on the bench outside the stall, and spent approximately 4 seconds telling himself that this was fine. It was an accident. These things happened in shared station environments. The professional response was to acknowledge it, not make a production out of it, and move on. He opened the door. Both sisters were still standing in the corridor outside. This surprised him. He had expected them to retreat to their quarters, to allow for the kind of mutual recovery time that most people would need after walking in on a coworker in a shower. Instead, they were right there. Ilya with her arms straight at her sides, Sareth with her hands clasped in front of her, and they were both looking at him with an expression that he still did not have a word for, but was becoming increasingly aware he needed one. "Technician Ward," Sareth said. Her tone was the same measured precision she used for everything, with the faintest edge of something underneath it that he thought might be discomfort, but could not be certain. "We owe you an apology. The information about the latch was not communicated to us. That was a failure on our part to inquire, and on your part to inform. Both failures are correctable." He almost smiled at that. The phrasing was so exactly like her, so precisely constructed, that it sounded less like an apology and more like a maintenance report for a social interaction that had malfunctioned. "It is fine," he said. "It was an accident." "Yes," she said. "Nevertheless," he nodded. They nodded. He went down the corridor to his quarters, and the door closed behind him, and he sat on the edge of his bunk and stared at the wall for a while. Neither of them had turned away. He did not know what to do with that. He did not know if it meant anything. He did not know if it was a Venari thing, a cultural norm he was unfamiliar with, a different relationship with the body and with privacy, and with what constituted an appropriate reaction. That was the most reasonable explanation. It was probably the correct explanation. He committed to it, but the image stayed with him, not the embarrassment of it, which faded quickly because he was not a person who held onto embarrassment when there was nothing to be embarrassed about. What stayed was the quality of the way they had looked at him, the steadiness of it, the absence of the flinch. He fixed the latch the next morning. It took 45 minutes and a replacement part from the storage bay on level 1 that he had been saving for the secondary waste processing unit, which was also broken, but less urgently broken than a door that 2 visiting officers might walk through at any time. He installed the new latch in silence while the station ran its automated morning checks around him, and the stars outside the corridor port continued their ancient business of burning at incomprehensible distances without offering any commentary on his situation. He did not mention the repair to the sisters. He logged it in the station maintenance record. Level 3 shower unit. Latch replaced at 0600. Reference ticket number 2311 Foxtrot. Then he went to the galley and started the coffee unit and sat down and waited for it to produce something that might or might not qualify as coffee, depending on whether it was a Wednesday. It was not a Wednesday. The coffee was acceptable. Ilya arrived at breakfast at the usual time. She sat across from him and ate the Venari protein supplement that the food unit produced. The compressed, chalk-colored block that she consumed without visible enthusiasm, but also without complaint. She ate the way she did most things, with a focused, efficient attention that suggested she was not particularly interested in the food itself, but understood that eating was necessary and was getting it done. After a moment, she said, "The latch on the level 3 shower unit. You repaired it this morning." "I did," he said. She looked at him with the gold eyes that he still could not read with any confidence. "You submitted the repair request 13 weeks ago." He took a sip of his coffee. "I kept pushing it down the list." She considered this, and now it has moved up the list. He looked at her over the rim of his cup. Seemed more urgent. The corner of Ilya's mouth moved. It was a small motion. On a human face, it might have been the beginning of a smile or might have been nothing. On a Venarfi face, he was starting to learn. The movements were smaller and more controlled, more deliberate. The muscles worked differently. Or perhaps the culture around expression worked differently, and small shifts carried more weight than they would have in a human conversation. He filed the motion under probably amused and decided he was probably right. Sareth arrived 6 minutes later, the same gap she left every morning between the end of her dawn drone cycle review and the start of breakfast. She ran the atmospheric survey drones on a morning schedule and checked their results before she ate, which meant she was always the last one to the galley. And Callum had noticed, without consciously noticing, that he had started timing his own breakfast around her arrival. She paused in the galley doorway. Her eyes moved from Callum to Ilya to Callum again. Something passed across her face that was too quick and too controlled for him to catch. She sat down. "After a moment," she said, "The drone results from Sector 12 are unusual." "Unusual how?" Callum asked. "The subsurface mineral composition has shifted since the last quarterly scan. Not dramatically, but measurably. The change is outside normal variance." She pulled up the data on her tablet and turned the screen toward him. "Your maintenance records. Do they show any seismic activity in that sector in the last 2 months?" He leaned forward to look at the screen, and she did not pull the tablet back, which meant they were both leaning over the same data at close range. He was aware, in the way you became aware of things in shared spaces when you had been living alone for a long time, of the quality of her skin this close, the faint luminous quality of it, the white of her hair where it fell forward from the braid, the smell of her, which was clean and metallic and faintly botanical, something he could not identify and did not ask about. "There was a minor fault line tremor about 9 weeks ago," he said. "Small, barely registered on the seismic monitor, but it could have been enough to shift the subsurface layers." Sareth made a sound, a low, brief sound that he recognized after a moment as the Venari equivalent of the noise a person makes when they are processing information and finding it interesting. She took the tablet back and began annotating the scan results, her fingers moving over the screen with the quick precision of someone who had been doing this kind of work for years. Ilya was watching them. He noticed in the same peripheral way that she had stopped eating and was sitting very still, her gold eyes moving between her sister and Callum, with an expression that was not the cataloging look of the first days, but something else, something closer to attention. The days after that developed a texture. He would not have been able to say when it happened exactly. When the strangeness of the 9th day faded and something else settled into the space it left behind, something that was not comfort in the ordinary sense of the word, but had its own kind of ease, a rhythm. The sisters maintained their work schedule. He maintained his. They crossed paths in the galley, in the survey room, in the corridors, and on the observation deck in the late hours when the work was finished and there was nothing left to do but sit with the stars and be quiet. He learned things about them the way you learn things about people when you share a small space and pay attention. Sareth was the older sister by what translated to roughly 4 standard years. She had been doing survey work for 12 of them, and she moved through data the way a person moved through a house they had lived in for a long time, without hurry, without hesitation, with the confidence of someone who knew where everything was and had the patience to look at it properly. When she found something interesting, she did not react visibly. She pressed 2 fingers to the side of her jaw and went quiet, and that was how you knew. Ilya was 3 years into her career and had a different quality to her attention. Where Sarath worked systematically, Ilya followed threads. She would be reading a standard geological scan and something in the data would catch her eye. A side note, an anomaly in the margins, a number that did not quite fit, and she would follow it. Sometimes the thread led somewhere. Sometimes it did not. Callum had the impression that the uncertainty itself was what she found appealing, that the possibility of discovering unexpected was more interesting to her than the certainty of finding what she already knew was there. He learned that they argued sometimes, in Venari, quick and low, with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from 2 people who had been disagreeing about the same kinds of things for most of their lives. The arguments did not seem to have winners. They ended with both sisters going quiet and then, usually, doing something else. And Callum suspected that the silence was the point. Not defeat, not agreement, but a mutual decision to stop and let the question sit for a while. He learned that Ilya, when she was reading data on her tablet and found something that truly interested her, went completely still. Not her ordinary careful attention, which was already quieter than most people's full engagement, but a deeper stillness. The kind that meant every part of her was focused on a single point. It reminded him of the way a sensor array locked onto a signal. Everything else dropped away. He learned that they exchanged looks sometimes, the 2 of them, quick glances that carried the weight of entire conversations he could not hear. 2 people who had spent enough years together to develop a private language made of small gestures and shared reference points that did not require words. He learned these things and added them to the picture he was building, and the picture kept turning out more interesting than he had expected. The thing he did not know how to address, the thing that sat at the back of his thoughts and surfaced at odd moments, was the shower incident and the specific detail that neither of them had looked away. He had decided, in the hours after it happened, that it was cultural. The Venari probably had different conventions around the body, different norms about what required an averted gaze and what did not. That was the simplest explanation, and almost certainly the correct one, and he had committed to it in the way you committed to a working theory. When the alternative was spending too much time thinking about something you did not have enough data to resolve. But then he would catch Ilya watching him across the galley with that focused, intent expression, the one that was exactly the same expression she wore when she was reading subsurface mineral data and had found something worth investigating. And the working theory would feel less solid than it had. He did not ask. He filed the question under things I do not have enough information about, and he left it there, and he went back to work. That was what he did. That was what he was good at. The work was always there, and the work always made sense. And if there were questions he could not answer, the work did not care about them. The station kept itself alive, the way it always had. The drones went out and came back. The atmospheric monitors tracked their numbers. The coffee unit performed its daily lottery between adequate and terrible, and somewhere in the background of all of it, under the routine and the maintenance logs and the quiet rhythm of 3 people sharing a small space at the far edge of known territory, something was shifting. He could feel it the way you felt a change in air pressure, not with any specific sense, but with a general awareness that the conditions had altered and that the alteration was still in progress. and that he did not yet know what shape it was going to take. Chapter 2. The days after the shower incident had a particular quality to them, the quality of something that had changed shape but had not yet settled into its new form. Callum went back to work. That was what he did when he did not know what to do about something. He went back to the thing he understood, the maintenance logs and the drone diagnostics and the slow ongoing negotiation between a station that was trying to fall apart and a technician who was trying to keep it together. The work did not care about the shower or the door or the gold eyes that had not looked away. The work cared about pressure, seals, and calibration tolerances, and whether the atmospheric relay was going to hold through the next storm cycle. He could live inside the work, and so he did. But the other thing was still there, underneath the routine, underneath the daily rhythm of meals and diagnostics, and the quiet hours on the observation deck. It was there, and it had a weight to it that he could not quite set down. He kept thinking about it at odd moments. Not the embarrassment. The embarrassment had faded within a day, because it had been an accident, and accidents did not require ongoing emotional investment. What he kept thinking about was the quality of the pause, that long, strange moment when the three of them had been frozen in the doorway and the shower stall, and the air had been full of steam and silence, and neither Sarath nor Ilya had performed the small, automatic gesture that most people performed in that situation. They had looked at him, not through him, not past him, not at the wall behind him, at him, with the same steady, direct attention they brought to everything. The same focused clarity that he was learning was not a performance but a default, the way they actually saw the world. He did not know what that meant. He was not sure it meant anything beyond what it was. But the question sat in his mind like a stone in a shoe, present and small and impossible to ignore entirely. The days kept moving. The station did not care about his internal weather. It needed things from him, and he provided them, and the providing was its own kind of comfort. He replaced a corroded fitting in the water reclamation line on the 11th day. He recalibrated the atmospheric monitoring array on the 12th, a task that took most of the afternoon and required him to crawl into an access panel on level 1 that was designed for someone approximately 6 inches shorter than he was. He ran the weekly drone fleet diagnostic on the 13th and found that Unit 7 had developed a slight drift in its navigation algorithm. Nothing dangerous, but enough to throw off the survey data if left uncorrected. He spent 2 hours writing a patch for the navigation code and another hour testing it. And when the drone flew clean on its next circuit, he felt the particular satisfaction of a problem identified, understood, and resolved. This was the work. This was what he was good at, finding the thing that was broken and making it not broken and moving on to the next thing. It was not complicated. It did not require inspiration or creativity or any of the other qualities that people sometimes attach to technical work in an effort to make it sound more interesting than it was. It required attention and patience and a willingness to get dirty, and he had all three in reliable supply. Sarath continued to ask him questions about the station systems, and the questions continued to be good ones, specific, well-framed, aimed at understanding rather than testing. She had a way of listening that he was learning to recognize, a quality of attention that was not passive but active, as though she was not just hearing his words but fitting them into a structure she was building in her mind. When she had enough pieces, she would nod once, that short, efficient motion, and move on. She never asked the same question twice. He appreciated that more than he would have expected. Ilya continued to appear in the workshop during his diagnostic runs. She would arrive without announcement, settle herself on the secondary workbench or lean against the wall near the tool rack, and watch him work. The first few times she had done this, in the early days before the shower, he had found it slightly disconcerting. The focused silence of it, the way she tracked his hands as he worked a repair, the stillness of her attention. But he had adjusted to it, the way he adjusted to most things on the station, by accepting it as part of the environment and not fighting it. Now, after the shower, he was aware of her presence in the workshop differently, not uncomfortably, but with a heightened attention to the fact that she was there, and that she was watching, and that her watching carried a quality he had not yet named. She spoke sometimes, during these visits, not always, and not predictably. Some days she watched in silence for 20 minutes and then left without a word. Other days, she would follow a thought out loud, the way she followed threads in the geological data, starting from one point and working her way through a series of connections that were not always obvious, but were always, when you followed them to their end, interesting. She talked about the belt expansion and the political dynamics of the committee that was reviewing the survey data. She talked about Venari survey tradition and the differences between the way her people approached geological assessment and the way humans did it. Differences that were partly methodological and partly philosophical, and that she found genuinely worth thinking about. She talked about the first survey she and Sareth had done together, 8 years ago. A moon with a methane atmosphere and 3 research domes and a power fault that had taken 4 days to repair. Was it the same kind of fault as your atmospheric relay? She asked one afternoon. The one you fixed last month? Probably not, he said. What was the failure mode? She told him. He told her about the relay casing and the corroded connector and the particular frustration of chasing a fault through a system that was old enough to have been repaired 6 times before him. Each repair layered on top of the last like geological strata. She listened with her full attention, the deep stillness that meant she was genuinely engaged. And when he finished, she said, "You are comfortable in practical work. It shows." It was the same register Sareth used when she commented on his competence. Not casual, not social, something more specific. A technical assessment of something they had genuinely observed and considered worth noting. He was starting to understand that the Venari spoke compliments in this register, as precise observations rather than social gestures. They did not tell you something was good to make you feel good. They told you it was good because they had evaluated it and concluded that it was, and the evaluation was the point. "It is what I am good at," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "It shows." She paused, and when she continued, there was a choosing quality to the pause, a sense of someone selecting the right word from several candidates. It is a comfortable thing to be around. He thought about that for a long time after she said it. On the 18th day, the atmospheric relay on the station's outer ring failed. It was not an emergency. The relay was one of 3, redundant by design, and the other 2 were functioning normally. But it was the kind of failure that compounded if you left it. The relay processed atmospheric data from the external sensors and fed it to the monitoring array on level 1. And without it, the array was running on 2 inputs instead of 3, which meant the margin for error was tighter and the risk of a cascade failure was higher. The fix required going outside. Callum pulled the EVA suit from the equipment locker on level 1 and began the pre-check procedure. Pressure seals, oxygen supply, thermal regulation, magnetic boots, tether line. The pre-check was 30 steps long, and he did every one of them in order without skipping any, because the pre-check was not the kind of thing you took shortcuts with when you were the only person on a station and the nearest help was 4 days away by transit ship. He was halfway through the sequence when Sareth appeared in the equipment room doorway. "The atmospheric relay," she said. It was not a question. She had read the diagnostic alert on the survey room terminal and come to find him, going out to fix it. He confirmed. He did not look up from the pressure seal he was testing. The seal was good. He moved to the next one. Sareth watched him work for a moment, and then she said, "Venari survey procedure requires a second operator at the tether control station during any external repair work. The requirement is not discretionary. Human survey protocol recommends it," he said. "Does not require it for solo-staffed stations. The recommendation exists because it is the safer option," she said. The fact that it is classified as a recommendation rather than a requirement does not change the underlying risk calculation. He looked up then. She was standing in the doorway with her hands at her sides, and the expression on her face was the one she wore when she had already thought through a problem and arrived at a conclusion and was waiting for him to arrive at the same one. He had seen this expression in the survey room when she disagreed with one of his data interpretations. It was patient, and it was firm, and it was going to wait him out. He could see that clearly. "You want to run the tether," he said. "I have EVA certification," she said. "Venari standard certification, which transfers under the authority's mutual recognition protocols. I am qualified." He considered it. She was right about the protocols. She was right about the risk calculation. He had been doing external repairs alone for 9 months and had managed every one of them without incident. But that was not the same thing as saying the risk was acceptable. It meant he had been lucky, or competent, or both, and neither of those was a guarantee. "All right," he said. "I will show you the tether control system." She learned it in 10 minutes. He had demonstrated the system to other people before. Resupply crew who were curious. Inspection officers who wanted to check that the equipment met standard. A safety auditor once who had asked him to walk through the entire procedure while she took notes. It usually took about 20 minutes for someone to feel confident with the controls. Sareth asked 3 questions, all of them precise, all of them aimed at the specific points where the system was different from the Venari equivalent she already knew. And by the time he was sealing the outer hatch, she was at the tether station with her hands on the controls, as though she had been there for years. The repair took an hour and 20 minutes. The relay casing had partially separated from its mounting bracket, which meant he had to hold the casing in position with one hand while the bonding compound cured, which required patience and steady hands and good magnetic boots, and a willingness to tolerate the cold that crept through the thermal layer of the suit, despite the manufacturer's assurances about temperature regulation. The cold settled into his fingers first, then his forearms, then the back of his neck, a slow, persistent intrusion that he managed the way he managed most discomfort, by acknowledging it and continuing to work. Below him and around him and in every direction, the stars were doing what they always did, existing at distances that turned station problems into very small things. He worked steadily. He did not rush. Rushing in external repair was how you made mistakes, and mistakes outside a station were not the same category of problem as mistakes inside one. Sareth kept the tether clean throughout. He could feel it in the line, the quality of her management. Every adjustment smooth, every length of slack exactly right, every tension shift timed to his movements before he had to ask for it. When he needed to move laterally along the hull to reach the secondary mounting point, she tracked him without instruction. The tether followed him like it was reading his mind, and, he thought, with the part of his brain that was not occupied with holding a relay casing in place while bonding compound dried, that she was very good at this. Not competent in the way that someone who had learned a procedure was competent. Good in the way that someone who understood the underlying logic of a system was good. When he came back through the hatch and unsealed the helmet, the station air hit his face like a warm hand. He stood in the equipment room and breathed and felt the cold begin to recede from his hands. And Sareth was already crossing the room toward him. The relay, she said. Fixed, he said. It should hold until the resupply ship comes through. I will log it for a full casing replacement at that point. She stopped in front of him and did something she had not done before. She reached out and checked the pressure seal on his right shoulder, pressing 2 fingers along the edge of the seal ring where it met the suit collar. It was a technical check. He recognized the motion from the EVA safety procedures, standard post-repair protocol, checking the suit integrity after exposure. But her fingers were close to his neck, and her gold eyes were on the seal and not on his face. And the moment lasted slightly longer than the motion required. A beat past the point where the check was complete and the information had been gathered. A beat where her fingers were still on the seal ring and she had not yet pulled them back. Clean, she said, and dropped her hand. Thank you, he said, for the tether. She met his eyes then, and the gold was steady and warm. And she said, you are a competent technician. It was in her register. A very specific statement. Not a general compliment, not a social nicety. Something with weight behind it. Something she had evaluated and confirmed and was now stating as a finding. And he had the sense, in the way you sometimes had a sense about a person's words that went beyond the words themselves, that she was telling him something particular with it. Something that extended past the tether and the relay and the pressure seal and into territory that he did not yet have a map for. Thank you, he said again, and meant it differently the second time. Ilya found him on the observation deck that evening. The observation deck was the best space on the station, a long sweep of reinforced glass that looked outward toward the unmapped sectors. In the late cycle hours, when the station's internal lighting dropped to its nighttime levels and the work was finished, the deck was dim and quiet and the stars were very bright. Callum had taken to spending his evenings there even before the sisters arrived. 9 months of sitting alone in a chair by the port and reading, or not reading, or just watching the dark and letting the day settle. Ilya sat in the chair beside him without asking, which was how she did most things. She arrived and she was there, and there was no negotiation about it. He was learning that this was not rudeness. It was directness. The Venari, or at least these 2 Venari, did not perform the small social rituals that humans use to manage shared space. They did not ask if the seat was taken, or if he minded company, or if he would prefer to be alone. They assessed the situation, made a decision, and acted on it. And if he had wanted to be alone, he suspected they would have understood that too, without him having to say it. He did not want to be alone. He was not sure when that had changed. They sat in silence for a while. Outside, a survey drone passed the port on its return trajectory, its running lights blinking red, white, red in the dark. Callum watched it until it disappeared around the curve of the station hull. "You went outside today," Ilya said. "I did, for an hour and 20 minutes. She said it with the flatness of someone reporting a number she had tracked. "Approximately," he said. She was looking at the stars, not at him. Her profile was sharp in the dim light, the line of her jaw, the fall of her cropped hair across her forehead. She said. Sareth was worried. He turned to look at her. She seemed calm. Her hands were resting on the arms of the chair, still and composed. "Sareth was worried," he repeated. A small pause. "She is very good at not appearing worried. It is a skill she has practiced for as long as I have known her, which is my entire life." He thought about Sareth at the tether controls, the smoothness of every adjustment, the precision of the tracking, the way the line had followed him across the hull without a single excess motion or a moment of slack that was not intentional. He had thought she was good at the tether. He now understood that she had been good at the tether because she had been paying very close attention, and the reason she had been paying very close attention was not entirely professional. She was watching the suit indicators the whole time, he said. Yes, Ilya said, she was. He turned back to the stars. The drone was gone. Another one was visible in the distance, a faint point of light moving slowly across the dark on its outbound survey circuit. Beside him, Ilya shifted in her chair. It was a small movement, a slight adjustment of position that brought her shoulder closer to his, not touching but close enough that he was aware of the proximity. The observation deck was warm, and she had taken off her field jacket and was wearing the close-fitted underlayer that all the Venari field suits used, a dark material that followed the lines of her frame. She was sitting close enough that he could have reached out and touched her arm without extending his hand fully. He did not reach out and touch her arm. He also did not pretend to himself that the thought had not occurred to him. Pretending was not a habit he had ever found useful, and the thought was there, and there was no point in acting like it was not. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes," she said. "The shower," he said, on the 9th day. He kept his voice even, conversational, the same tone he would have used to ask her about survey data or drone calibration. "You did not turn away." A pause. The drone's running lights had disappeared around the curve of the station. "No," she said. He waited. She did not offer anything else for a moment, and he let the silence sit, because he was good at silence, and because he could feel that she was working towards something, and that pushing would not help. "Is that a Venari thing?" he said eventually. "Cultural." He was not sure how to frame the question without it sounding like an accusation, which it was not, or a complaint, which it was also not, or was it something else? Ilya was quiet for long enough that he started to think she was not going to answer. The observation deck hummed faintly around them, the low constant vibration of the life support systems doing their work. Then she said, "It is not a cultural thing. Venari would typically turn away in the same situation. The convention exists. We have the same social reflex that you have." "Okay," he said. "Sareth did not turn away," Ilya said, "because she was surprised, and because she is Sareth. And Sareth does not do things automatically. She considers them first, even the things that most people do without thinking. She thinks about, and then she decides. And sometimes her decisions is the same as what other people do automatically, and sometimes it is not." A pause. "I did not turn away," Ilya continued, "because I was surprised, and because you did not look afraid, and because..." She stopped. "Because," he said, "because I did not want to." She said it the way she said most things, simply, directly, without decoration or softening. The Venari preference for saying the exact thing you meant and not an approximate version of it, not bluntness, precision. The difference mattered. "I made a choice," she said. "It was a deliberate one. I saw you, and the reflex was there, the impulse to look away. And I did not follow it, not because I forgot or because I froze, because I decided not to." He sat with that for a moment, The observation deck was very quiet. The stars were very bright. Somewhere in the station, a ventilation cycle shifted, and the air moved slightly against his face. "All right," he said. "Is that?" She started, and then stopped, and then continued. She turned her head to look at him, and the gold eyes were on him fully, and the expression in them was the one he had been trying to read for 18 days. The cataloging attention that was not impersonal. That had never been impersonal. The look of someone who wanted to understand what they were seeing, genuinely and completely. The way she wanted to understand a geological anomaly or a mineral composition scan or anything else that caught her attention and held it. "Does that cause a problem?" she said. "No," he said. "I do not think so." "Good," she said, and she went back to looking at the stars. They sat there for another hour, and the silence was the kind that needed no filling. And he thought about what she had said. "I made a choice. It was a deliberate one." And he thought that this was something he was going to need to sit with for a while, probably, and think about carefully, probably, but not tonight. Tonight it was enough to sit here with the stars and the quiet and the warmth of another person close enough to reach, but not reaching, and to let the thing be what it was without trying to name it. He spent the rest of the evening not working. He went back to the workshop after Ilya left the observation deck, and he ran a calibration on the drone navigation array that did not need calibrating. He checked the atmospheric relay data from the repair he had done that afternoon, which was functioning perfectly and did not need checking. He stood at the small port in the workshop and looked out at the dark for a while, which accomplished nothing, but was at least honest about accomplishing nothing. The thing was, he understood what she had said. He understood it the way you sometimes understood something that arrived already complete, already assembled, without the usual process of reasoning your way through it. You did not need to work it out. You just recognized it, the way you recognized a piece of equipment you had seen before, the shape of it already familiar even if you had not put words to it yet. "I made a choice. It was deliberate." She had told him the thing plainly, in the Venari way that did not soften and did not perform and did not wrap the meaning in qualifications or escape routes. She had said what she meant, and what she meant was now in the room with him, and he could not put it somewhere else. He could not file it under cultural difference or observational quirk or any of the other categories he had been using to manage the things he noticed about the Cavern sisters that did not fit neatly into the framework of colleagues sharing a station. He had been on this station for 9 months. Before the sisters arrived, the station had been his in the drones and the automated systems and the slow, predictable rhythm of maintenance and data logging and sleep. The days had had a clean logic to them, a simplicity that was not emptiness but was also not fullness. He had not been unhappy. He was not a person who required a great deal from his surroundings. He needed the work to make sense and the coffee to be drinkable and the stars to be there when he looked out the port. And most days he had all three. But he recognized now, with the particular clarity that came from contrast, what the difference felt like. The station that had held one person and the station that held three. The shape of the days before and the shape of the days now. The difference was not dramatic. It was not the kind of thing anyone watching from outside would have noticed. But he felt it, the way you felt a change in gravity when you moved from one section of a station to another. The same space, the same structure, but the weight of things was different. He did not know what he was going to do about that. He was not sure he needed to do anything yet. He was fairly sure, standing in his workshop on the 18th night, with 2 Venari women somewhere else in the station, and the stars proceeding with their ancient business outside the port, that something was already happening, that the doing was already underway, had been underway since the 9th day, or maybe before, and that his participation in it was not the kind that required a decision so much as an acknowledgement. He went to bed. He slept well, which was either a good sign or evidence that his instincts were further ahead of his conscious mind than he had realized. He thought about it for 3 days. During those 3 days, nothing happened that would have seemed significant to an outside observer. He replaced the relay casing with a better part he found in a storage crate on level 1 that had been there since before Dara's time, and had been mislabeled as a water processor component. He ran the standard diagnostics. He ate his meals at the usual times. The coffee unit continued its unpredictable relationship with quality. Ilya's side thread in the Sector 12 data turned out to lead somewhere. The anomalous mineral signature she had been tracking for a week resolved into something genuinely interesting. A subsurface composition shift that did not match any of the known geological models for the region. She brought it to Sarath, and Sarath agreed it was worth flagging for the Expansion Review Board. They spent 2 days working through the implications together in the survey room, their heads close together over the data, exchanging rapid Venari when they disagreed about the scope of the anomaly, which was often, and falling into focused silence when they agreed, which was also often. Callum watched them work, not deliberately, not with any conscious intent, but in the way you watched the things around you in a small space when you were paying attention. He saw the way Sarah's hand moved when she was explaining something she considered important, a slow, precise gesture that tracked the shape of the idea in the air. He saw the way Ilya leaned forward when she disagreed, her whole body angling toward the data, as though she could get closer to the truth by getting physically closer to the screen. He thought about what Ilya had said on the observation deck. He thought about the way Sarath had said, "You are a competent technician with the weight of something specific underneath it, something that went beyond the relay and the tether and the pressure seal." He thought about 13 weeks of a broken latch, and one morning that had changed everything about the texture of the days on this station. He thought about these things, and the thinking did not reach a conclusion, and the absence of a conclusion did not bother him as much as he might have expected. Some things were not meant to be concluded. Some things were meant to be sat with, and watched, and allowed to take whatever shape they were going to take. On the 21st day, the ventilation system on level 2 threw an error code that turned out to be a faulty sensor rather than an actual problem, and he spent the morning replacing the sensor and recalibrating the system, and not thinking about gold eyes and choices that were deliberate, or rather, thinking about them, but in the background. The way the station's life support system ran in the background, always there, always working, not requiring his active attention but present nonetheless. The stars outside the port did what stars always did. The drones completed their circuits. The station kept itself alive, steady and dim and patient, the way it had kept itself alive for years before he arrived, and would keep itself alive for years after he left. And somewhere inside the station, in the survey room or the galley or the quarters on level 2, 2 women with gold eyes and white hair and skin that caught the light like deep water were doing their work and living their days and carrying, he suspected, their own version of the same question he was carrying. He did not ask them about it. Not yet. The question would keep. And in the meantime, there was work to do. And the work was always there. And the work always made sense, even when other things did not. Chapter 3. Other evenings. He found himself in the survey room with one or the other of them, working late over data that was only partly the reason they were there. Ilya talked more than he had expected, not in the way that people talked when they were filling silence, not chatter, not the endless surface-level commentary that some people use to keep the quiet at bay. She talked the way she followed threads in the data, starting from one point and following a line of thought through a series of connections that were not always obvious, but were always, when you trace them to the end, worth following. She would begin with the belt expansion, the political dynamics of the review board, the competing interests of the member systems, and the way those interests shaped which surveys got funded and which got shelved. From there, she would move into Venari's survey tradition, the differences between the way her people approached geological assessment and the way humans did, differences that went deeper than methodology into something closer to philosophy. The Venari, she explained, tended to treat geological survey as a form of reading. The planet or the asteroid or the moon was a text, and the survey was the act of interpretation, and the quality of the interpretation depended not just on the tools you used but on the quality of attention you brought to the reading. Humans, she said, tend to approach survey as measurement. You want numbers. You want data points. You want the thing quantified so you can compare it to other quantified things and draw conclusions. This is not wrong, but it is a particular way of seeing. And the Venari way, he said, is also particular, she said. We want to understand what the numbers are doing, not just what they are, but what they are becoming, the direction of change, the trajectory. She said this with a slight forward lean in her chair, the same lean she used in the survey room when she disagreed with Sarath about the scope of an anomaly. And he thought that this was one of the things he was starting to like about her. The engagement, the willingness to follow a thought past the point where most people would have stopped, into territory that was uncertain and possibly wrong and therefore interesting. From survey philosophy, she moved into the first survey she had done with Sarath 8 years ago, a moon called something he could not pronounce, with a methane atmosphere and 3 domed research stations, and a power fault that had taken 4 days to resolve. She described the fault with the same technical precision Callum would have used, and he found himself asking questions, real questions, the kind that came from genuine curiosity rather than politeness. And she answered them with the same seriousness. Was it fixed the same way as your atmospheric relay? She asked. The one from last week. Probably not, he said. What was the failure mode? She told him. He told her about the relay casing and the corroded mounting bracket and the particular challenge of holding a heavy component in position, while bonding compound cured in near-zero temperatures with magnetic boots that were losing grip on a hull plate that needed replacing. She listened with the full, deep stillness. And when he finished, she said, "You are comfortable in practical work. It shows. It is a comfortable thing to be around." He thought about that sentence for a long time afterward. The construction of it. The way she had started with an observation about him and ended with a statement about its effect on her. And the bridge between those two things was the word comfortable, which she had used twice, deliberately, meaning something slightly different each time. "It is what I am good at," he said. "Yes," she said. "It shows." There were evenings when he sat with Sarath in the galley after dinner, the meal finished and the food units cleaned and the station settling into its late cycle hum. And they would talk about the expansion committee report she was preparing. She would describe a section she was working on, lay out the argument she was building, and sometimes she would say a sentence and stop, and he would finish the technical thought she had been constructing, and she would look at him with the gold eyes, in a way that told him she had not expected to be understood that quickly. "You read geological survey data," she said once, in the middle of one of these conversations. She said it with a note of something that was not quite surprise, but was adjacent to it. "I maintain geological survey stations," he said. "You read enough of anything, you start to understand it." "It is more than maintenance understanding," she said. He shrugged. 9 months is a long time. She looked at him for a moment, and the gold eyes were doing the thing they did. The focused evaluation that was not cold but was thorough. The look of someone who was fitting a new piece of information into a picture she had been building, and finding that it changed the picture more than she had expected. "Yes," she said, "it is." And he was fairly sure they were talking about 2 different things at once, which was becoming a pattern with Sarath. The surface of what she said was always precise and always true, but there was often a second layer underneath it, a meaning that ran parallel to the stated meaning, and that you could only catch if you were paying close enough attention. Ilya was transparent in her directness. What she said was what she meant, and the meaning was right there, accessible, immediate. Sarath was also precise, also committed to saying the true thing, but the true thing she said tended to operate on more than one level, and he was only beginning to learn where the levels were. He noticed, for instance, that she arrived at the galley at approximately the same time every morning, within a 3-minute window, reliable enough that he had unconsciously started timing his own coffee to it. He noticed that she paid attention to whether he was sleeping, not in an intrusive way, not by asking or commenting, but in the way of someone who had registered that rest was a relevant variable and was tracking it alongside other things she considered worth tracking. She had mentioned once, in passing, during a conversation about station protocols, that the standard rest deficit guidelines for solo staff stations were inadequate in her professional assessment. He had said nothing. She had not followed up. He had gone to bed 30 minutes earlier that night and had the clear sense that she had noticed. He noticed that she sometimes asked him questions she already knew the partial answer to. Questions about the station systems, or the drone calibration, or the atmospheric monitoring protocols. Questions where her follow-up made it clear. She had already worked out most of the answer on her own, and was checking whether his answer matched. He found he did not mind this. He would have minded it from someone who was testing him, who was looking for gaps or weaknesses. He did not mind it from someone who was thinking alongside him and wanted to see if they arrived at the same place. One evening, she asked him why he had chosen Solus specifically. They were in the galley. Late, the kind of hour where the conversation could go in any direction because the day's work was done and neither of them was in a hurry to leave. The posting was available, he said.
I needed the posting.
There were other postings available, she said, which confirmed that she had looked into this, that she had, at some point, checked the authorities' staffing records to see what other options had been open to him when he took this assignment. He considered for a moment how much to say. He was not a person who talked about himself easily, not because he was guarded, but because he did not find himself to be a particularly interesting subject. But she had asked, and the question was genuine, and she was looking at him with the steady attention that meant she actually wanted the answer. I wanted somewhere far enough out that the work would be the thing, he said. Not politics, not station hierarchy, not the performance of being busy that you get at larger installations. Just the work and the equipment and the time to do it right. Sareth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You have done it right." It was the assessment register, the same tone she used for technical evaluations, for data conclusions, for statements she had arrived at through observation and analysis and was now stating as findings. He recognized it, and the recognition carried a weight that he felt in his chest. "How would you know?" he said. "You have been here 3 weeks. I read your maintenance logs when we arrived," she said. "All 9 months of them." He looked at her. "That is a lot of reading." It was informative. A small pause, and the gold eyes held his without wavering. "You are thorough. You are more thorough than the minimum requires, which means you are thorough because you believe it matters, not because someone is checking." She turned the data tablet over in her hands, a small motion that he thought was the closest thing to a fidget he had ever seen from her. "This is also not common in my experience," she said. He thought about what Ilya had said in the workshop days earlier. "You are comfortable in practical work. It shows. It is a comfortable thing to be around." And he thought that the Cavern sisters apparently approached the same territory from different angles and arrived at the same place, which was, probably, how sisters worked. "You two have talked about me," he said. "We have had several conversations." Sareth said. No inflection, no defensiveness. A plain statement of fact. "Good things, I hope." She looked at him steadily. The gold eyes, the controlled surface, the warmth underneath it that he was learning to find. "You would not be at this table if they were not," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, and then he looked down at his coffee and did not say anything else, because there was nothing useful left to say, and the silence that settled between them was the kind that held its own content, the kind that did not need words because the words had already done their work, and what remained was just two people sitting in a galley at the edge of mapped space, understanding something they were not yet ready to say out loud. Ilya told him a story one night on the observation deck. It was late in the 3rd week, and the station was quiet in the way it got late in the cycle when the automated systems had finished their evening routines and the ventilation had settled into its nighttime rhythm. They were sitting in their usual arrangement, Ilya in the chair beside him, both of them facing the port, the stars arrayed across the dark in their cold, patient patterns. "The first survey I did alone," she said, "was a dead station in the inner belt." She did not preamble it. She did not explain why she was telling him. She simply began, the way she followed threads in the data, because the thought was there, and she was following it. "No crew," she said. "Failed power systems. An atmospheric leak that had been running for 6 months before anyone noticed. My job was to catalog the remaining equipment and assess whether the station could be salvaged." "What happened to it?" he asked. "Decommissioned. Stripped for parts." She was quiet for a moment. "I spent 4 days in that station by myself. The atmospheric systems were running on backup power, which meant the air was breathable, which meant there was no emergency, just a very dead station and a great deal of paperwork." She shifted in her chair, and her voice took on a quality he had not heard before. Not the focused directness of her usual speech, not the analytical tone she used for data and survey work. Something quieter, something that had been carried for a while and had settled into its own shape. "On the 3rd day," she said, "I found the personal effects of the last crew member who had been stationed there. A small container, food rations that had expired, a picture of someone I did not recognize, and a handwritten log." She paused. "The log had been kept for 2 years," she said. "Every day, documenting the work, the weather conditions on the surface, the equipment status. Occasionally, notes about what he had eaten that day or what he had seen through the observation port. The last entry was the day he left. He did not write anything remarkable in the final entry. He wrote that the weather was clear and that he had packed his things and that the shuttle was arriving in the afternoon. Callum waited. I read the whole log, Ilya said. It took most of the third day. It was not exciting reading. It was the record of an ordinary person doing ordinary work at an ordinary station for 2 years. And at the end of it, he had packed his box and gone home. And 6 months later, the power had failed, and the atmosphere had leaked. And nobody had noticed for long enough that the station was past saving by the time anyone came to check. She turned her head to look at him, and the gold eyes were steady. And the expression in them was the one he had been learning to read. The one that was not the cataloging attention of the early days, but something that had passed through familiarity and settled into something warmer and more specific. The way a question you had been turning over for a long time stopped feeling like a question and started feeling like a place you recognized. I think about that log sometimes, she said. Someone spent 2 years filling it with very small things, daily things, things that only mattered because someone was there to notice them. And then he left, and the small things went with him, and what remained was just a station that had stopped working. Did you keep the log? He asked. I submitted it with my report. The Directorate archives personal effects. She looked back at the stars. But I have thought about it many times since, she said. The difference between a place that someone is in and a place that someone has left. The observation deck was very quiet. Somewhere in the station, a ventilation cycle shifted, and the air moved faintly. I think about that too, he said. Most of my work is in places that people are about to leave or have already left. I keep them going until the next person arrives. Yes, she said. I have noticed this about you. You take it seriously. The station, he said. The keeping, she said. He looked at her for a moment. The gold eyes were on him, steady and clear, and what they carried was not the cataloging attention of the first week, but something that had settled through familiarity into something warmer. The way a question you have been turning over for a while stops feeling like a question and starts feeling like knowledge. I do, he said. Take it seriously. Yes, she said again, and went back to the stars. They sat there for a long time after that, and neither of them said anything else. And the silence was the kind that contained more than most conversations. On the 22nd day, Callum went to the survey room and found Sarah there alone. It was the late cycle. The station was quiet. Ilya had gone to her quarters an hour earlier, and the corridors were empty in the way they got at this hour. When the automated systems ran their nighttime checks and the lights dropped to their lowest setting, and the whole station felt like it was holding its breath. Sarah looked up when he came in. Her hands were on the data terminal, and the glow of the screen lit the planes of her face, the deep blue of her skin, the white of her hair where it caught the light. The Sector 13 results, she said. I was going to send you the summary in the morning. I can look at them now if you want, he said. She pulled up the summary on the central display, and he came and stood beside her, and she walked him through the findings in the ordered, methodical way she did everything. The mineral composition data from the latest drone sweep, the comparison with the previous quarter's readings, the anomalies she had flagged and the ones she had dismissed, and her reasoning for each decision. He followed her explanations and asked the questions that were genuinely useful, and she answered them with the same seriousness she gave to Ilya's questions, which he noticed and appreciated. When they were done with the results, she did not move away from the screen, and he did not move away from her. They stood there, close enough that he could smell the clean metallic scent of her, the faint botanical undertone he still could not identify. And the survey data was still glowing on the screen between them, and neither of them was looking at it. Ilya spoke to you, Sarah said. It was not a question. On the observation deck, he confirmed. 3 days ago, she told me. Sarah's voice was measured, the same precision she brought to everything. But there was a quality underneath it that he had not heard before, a careful quality, as though she was placing each word deliberately and checking its position before moving to the next one. She typically does not tell me the content of her own conversations. She told me this one. Why, he said. Sarah turned to look at him, and in the gold eyes he saw the same 2-finger-at-jaw consideration that she usually directed at data and survey results and anomalous mineral signatures, turned now on him with its full focused weight. Because, she said, she thought I should say something also. The survey room was very quiet. The data terminal hummed softly outside the port. The stars were doing what they always did. And are you, he said, saying something? She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that was not hesitation but preparation, the kind that meant a person was assembling what they wanted to say with the precision that the saying required. I did not turn away, Sarath said, because you did not look like a person who needed to be looked away from. She paused, not for effect, for accuracy. She was choosing the next words the way she chose data categories, with deliberate care. You looked, she said, like a person who knew what he was and was not distressed by it. That is not a common thing in my experience. Most people, when they are caught in a vulnerable position, show some version of shame or panic, or the need to be reassured that the situation is not as bad as it seems. You did not do any of those things. You said the latch is broken, and you meant it as a plain statement of fact, because it was one. He thought about standing in the shower with the water off, and two Venari women in the doorway and saying, the latch is broken, and meaning nothing more or less than what the words said, because it was broken, and because stating the fact of the broken thing was what he did. It was his job. It was his instinct. When something was broken, you said so, and then you fixed it. That is a strange thing to find interesting, he said. Many things I find interesting are strange, she said, and there was the slightest shift in her voice, a fractional warming that he was fairly sure was the Venari version of a wry remark. On her face, it showed as the barest movement at the corner of her mouth, so small that he would have missed it 2 weeks ago, but did not miss it now. He was quiet for a moment. The survey room hummed around them, the data terminal casting its pale light, the stars steady outside the port. Then he said, Ilya said she made a choice, that it was deliberate. Yes, Sarath said. Was yours, he said. She met his eyes. The gold in them was steady and entirely serious, without any of the wry warmth of a moment ago. The look of a person who was about to say something she considered important, and wanted him to understand that she considered it important. Yes, she said, considerably. He thought about that word, considerably, the weight of it in the register of a person who was precise about language and would not use a word for effect if she did not mean it exactly. A person who measured her words the way she measured data, with attention and care, and a refusal to approximate when accuracy was available. He thought about two sisters who had stood in a doorway and made separate deliberate choices and then told each other about it, weeks later. About the conversation between them that he had not witnessed, the one where Ilya had said I told him, and Sarath had listened. And they had arrived at whatever they had arrived at together. This is a 40-day assignment, he said. 22 days remain, she said, without hesitation, without needing to calculate, which meant she had been counting. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, slowly, are you telling me that both of you? He stopped. He was not sure how to phrase the question. He was not sure there was a way to phrase it that would not sound presumptuous or reductive, or like he was making assumptions about a dynamic he did not fully understand. Sarath, because she was Sarath, provided the framing he could not find. Venari do not typically compete, she said. It was the most carefully constructed sentence he had heard from her, and he had heard many carefully constructed sentences from her, each word placed with architectural precision, the whole structure designed to carry a specific meaning without ambiguity. We discuss, she continued. We come to arrangements. The nature of the arrangement depends on the situation and the people involved, and it is arrived at through conversation, not through contest. She paused. Ilya and I have discussed, she said. We would like to know if you are interested in discussing. The survey room was very quiet. The data terminal hummed. The stars did their work outside the port. He thought about the observation deck, Ilya's quiet directness. I did not want to turn away. I made a choice. It was a deliberate one. He thought about Sarath's version, the same content, navigated through a more careful architecture. You looked like a person who knew what he was. Both of them had looked, and both of them had chosen, and they had told each other, and they had discussed, and now they were asking. I think, he said carefully, that I would like to discuss. Something shifted in Sarath's expression, small, precise, the same controlled motion he was learning to read. The calibrated shift that would have been invisible to someone who did not know what to look for. What it said was something close to good, and something close to relief, and something else that he could not name, but that he recognized as genuine. "Then we will," she said. She held his gaze for another moment, and then she turned back to the data terminal, and the glow of the screen settled back over her face, and she began closing out the files she had been working on, with the same methodical care she brought to everything. He stood there for a moment longer, in the quiet survey room, with the stars outside, and the data terminal humming, and the weight of what had just happened settling into the space between them, like something that had been waiting for a long time to arrive and had finally, quietly, without drama or spectacle, arrived. Then he said, "Good night, Sarath." "Good night, Callum," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. It sat differently in the air than technician or ward. It sat the way a key sat in a lock it was made for, with the small, precise click of something fitting into place. He went back to his quarters and sat on the edge of his bunk and looked at the wall and thought about what had just happened and what it meant and what was going to happen next. He did not arrive at any conclusions. The situation did not lend itself to conclusions. It lent itself to the particular kind of openness that came from recognizing that you were in the middle of something that was still taking shape, and that your job was not to direct the shape, but to pay attention to it. He thought about 40 days and how many were left and what those remaining days might hold. He thought about the shower door swinging open on the 9th day, and 2 women with gold eyes standing in the light, and the particular quality of not turning away, the deliberateness of it, which he understood now differently than he had then, not as a cultural artifact, not as a reflex that had failed to fire, as a choice. 2 separate choices made by 2 separate people who happened to be sisters and who had, in their own time and in their own way, arrived at the same place. He thought about Ilya's story about the dead station and the handwritten log, the difference between a place that someone is in and a place that someone has left. The keeping, she had said. You take the keeping seriously. He thought about the fact that he had been keeping this station alive for 9 months, alone in the quiet dark at the edge of charted space, and that the keeping had been enough. It had been enough to fill the days and give them meaning and sustain him through the long stretches between resupply ships. But enough was not the same as full, and full was not something he had known he was missing until 2 women in silver field suits had stepped through his docking seal and paused at the same moment to look around. And the station had changed. Not the station itself. The station was the same metal and glass and recycled air it had always been. What had changed was the quality of occupancy. The difference between maintaining a place alone and sharing it with people who saw you clearly and were not troubled by what they saw. He slept well that night. The kind of sleep that came from a decision that had not quite been made but had been acknowledged as coming. And the acknowledgement was enough to quiet the questions for now. Outside, the stars did what they always did. The drones completed their circuits. The atmospheric relay he had fixed held steady. The bonding compound cured and solid, the way things were when you fixed them properly and did not cut corners. 22 days. He could feel them stretching out ahead of him, not empty but waiting, the way a station waited between ships, patient, ready, holding its shape for whatever came next. Chapter 4. The remaining 22 days were different, not in any way that would have been visible from the outside. The work continued. The survey data came in from the drones and was processed and cataloged and filed. The maintenance schedule ran its course. The atmospheric monitors tracked their numbers. The coffee unit maintained its unpredictable relationship with quality. If someone had been watching from a distance, tracking the daily rhythms of the station, they would have seen no change at all. 3 people doing their jobs in a small station at the edge of charted space, the same way they had been doing them for the past 3 weeks. What changed was underneath. It was in the way time moved through the days. The particular quality of mornings in the galley when all 3 of them were present, and the conversation was easy, and the silences between sentences carried something they had not carried before. A warmth, an awareness, the knowledge, shared but not spoken, that they had crossed a line and were now on the other side of it. And the other side was different from what any of them had expected but was not, in any way that mattered. Wrong. Callum learned more things about them by accumulation, the same way he had learned everything else. By paying attention and letting the details build into a picture, he learned that Ilya when she was genuinely amused by something, made a sound that was barely audible and entirely involuntary. A low note, quick and soft, that seemed to escape from somewhere in her throat before she could catch it. It was not a laugh in the way humans laughed. It was something more private than that, more involuntary, a sound the body made when it was surprised by its own pleasure. And he noticed that Sareth, hearing this sound, would not react, would not look up, would not acknowledge it, would not smile. But the quality of her non-reaction was distinctly different from her ordinary non-reaction in a way that he could not have explained to anyone else but recognized immediately. It was the non-reaction of someone who was aware of the sound and pleased by it and deliberately choosing not to draw attention to the fact that she was pleased, because drawing attention to it would make Ilya self-conscious, and that would mean she might stop making the sound, and Sareth did not want her to stop. He learned that Sareth had a gap in her survey training that surprised him. She had never performed an external drone repair. She had supervised dozens of them from inside a station, monitoring the procedure on the data terminal and managing communications with the technician outside. But she had never held the tools herself, never felt the cold through the suit's thermal layer, never dealt with the particular challenge of fine motor work in magnetic boots on a curved hull. When he mentioned this in passing one afternoon, describing a repair he had done the previous month, she went quiet in the way that meant she was thinking. And the next morning she asked him to show her the procedure. He set up a practice run on the workbench in the workshop, using a decommissioned drone and the same tools he would use in an actual repair. She watched the first demonstration with her full attention, asked 2 questions, and then tried it herself. Her hands were careful and precise, the same hands that managed the tether controls with such clean efficiency. But the tools were unfamiliar, and the first attempt was rough. The second was better. The third was clean. When she completed the third repair successfully, she looked up at him, and the gold eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the drone, or the repair, or the tools. It was the brightness of someone who had learned something new and was pleased by the learning, and also pleased that the person who had taught her had seen her learn it. He held her gaze for a moment, and the warmth of it sat in his chest like a slow fire. And he thought, this is one of the things I am going to remember. He learned that they had been working together for 8 years, and that the synchrony between them, the simultaneous pauses, the shared looks, the conversations conducted in half-sentences and quick Venari exchanges that contained more information than their brevity suggested, was the product of those 8 years. It was partly the nature of sisters, the deep, cellular familiarity of 2 people who had grown up in the same space and knew each other the way you knew your own hands. But it was also the specific kind of bond that formed between 2 people who had spent most of their professional lives doing serious work in difficult places together. They had shared stations and survey ships and research domes on moons with methane atmospheres. They had disagreed and argued and arrived at arrangements. They had built a working relationship that was also a personal relationship that was also something else entirely, something that did not have a clean label and did not need one. Callum was, by comparison, a new element in an established system. He understood this without anyone having to say it. The equation had been balanced for 8 years, 2 variables in a stable configuration, and now there was a third, and the equation was adjusting. They were all adjusting. The process was not uncomfortable, but it was real, and it required the kind of attention that you could not fake and could not rush. Some evenings, all 3 of them ended up on the observation deck. These were the hours he would remember most clearly afterward, though he did not know that yet. They would arrange themselves in whatever configuration the evening called for. Sometimes Ilya on his right and Sareth on his left. Sometimes both sisters in the 2 chairs nearest the port with him behind them. Sometimes all 3 of them facing the glass in a loose row, close but not quite touching. The stars would be there, the way they always were. The survey drones would be running their circuits, visible as faint points of light, moving through the dark on their outbound and return trajectories. The station would keep itself alive around them, humming and cycling and doing all the small automated things it did to maintain the conditions necessary for life, and none of them would need to say anything. He noticed things in those quiet hours that he did not notice in the busy ones. The way Sareth's breathing changed when she relaxed. It slowed and deepened and took on a faintly metronomic quality, steady as a system running clean. He found it calming, in a way he had not expected. The rhythm of it was the rhythm of a person who had stopped working, stopped evaluating, stopped constructing the careful architecture of her speech and her attention, and was simply present. It was rare, he thought, to see her like this. To see the evaluation pause and the person underneath it settle into stillness. He felt privileged to witness it, though he would not have used that word out loud. The way Ilya's hands moved when she was thinking. Small, almost gestures that did not quite complete themselves. The beginning of emotion that stopped before it became emotion, as though her body was reaching for something her mind had not yet identified. Thoughts that had not found words yet, expressed as the ghost of movement in her fingers. He watched these movements and did not interrupt them, and found that they told him more about what she was thinking than her words sometimes did. The quality of attention they both brought to the stars, not casual, not the glazed, half-aware look that people sometimes wore when they stared at something beautiful for long enough that the beauty became background noise. This was genuine attention, the focused, respectful attention of people who had spent enough time in deep space to have earned a real relationship with it, who understood, not just intellectually but in their bodies and their bones, what it meant to be this far from anything else, this small in comparison to the distances involved, this dependent on the thin skin of metal and glass that separated the air they breathed from the void that would kill them. Callum had spent 9 months earning his own version of that relationship, the particular solitude of knowing that the nearest other human being was 4 days away by transit ship. He had not found it unbearable. He had found it clarifying. The isolation stripped things down to their essentials. What mattered and what did not. What you needed and what you only thought you needed. What you could live without and what you could not. But he recognized, watching the two of them at the observation port, sitting in the low light with their gold eyes on the dark, that there was a version of that solitude he had not known he was inside until it ended. And the ending of it sat somewhere behind his sternum in a way he could not quite put down and did not want to put down and was beginning to understand he did not need to put down. It was all right to carry it. The weight of it was not a burden. It was more like ballast, something that kept him steady, that gave the days a center of gravity they had not had before. One night, near the end of the second week after the conversation in the survey room, he asked Ilya how she had chosen survey work. It was a simple question, the kind of thing people asked each other in small spaces to fill time, or because they were curious, or because they wanted to hear the other person talk about something that mattered to them. She answered it simply at first. The directorate had offered a placement. She had taken it. Sarath had already been 2 years in the field and had spoken well of the work. But then she kept going, following the thread, the way she always did, because the thought was there, and it was interesting, and she wanted to see where it went. She told him about her first solo assignment, the dead station in the inner belt, the one she had told him about before. But this time she went deeper. She described the corridors and the dust and the way the backup lighting had cast everything in a pale amber glow that made the dead equipment look like it was sleeping rather than broken. She described the sound of her own footsteps in the empty halls, the echo of them, the way the station had amplified every small noise because there was nothing else to absorb the sound. She described the log again, the 2 years of daily entries, the weather reports and equipment notes and occasional remarks about meals. And then she said something she had not said before. The thing about the log, she said, is that it was written for no one. He was not writing to an audience. He was not composing a record for the archives. He was writing because writing was how he kept track of himself, how he confirmed each day that he was still there and that the day had happened and that the small things he had done and seen were real. She was quiet for a moment. I understood that, she said. When I read it, I understood it immediately. The need to mark the days, to put something down in writing that says I was here, and this is what happened, and it mattered, even if the only person it mattered to was me. She turned her head to look at him, and the gold eyes were very clear. You do the same thing, she said, with your maintenance logs. He had not thought about it that way before. The maintenance logs were functional documents, equipment status, repair records, diagnostic results, resource tracking. They were the kind of thing the authority required and the resupply coordinator occasionally reviewed, and nobody else ever read, except, apparently, Sarath, who had read all 9 months of them. But Ilya was right. They were also something else. They were also a record of his presence, a daily confirmation that he had been here and had done the work, and that the work had held. Every entry that said relay repaired, or calibration completed, or drone unit 7 returned to service was also, underneath the technical language, an entry that said, I am still here. The station is still running. I kept it going for another day. Maybe, he said. Not maybe, she said. And she said it with a warmth that he felt more than heard, a quality in the dual tone of her voice that was not the analytical precision of her survey work, but something softer and more personal and directed entirely at him. They sat with that for a while, and the stars did their work outside the port, and neither of them said anything else about it, and neither of them needed to. There were evenings when the three of them sat together and talked about nothing in particular, and the nothing was better than most some things he could remember. Sarath would describe a problem she was working through in the assessment report, not because she needed help, but because thinking out loud was how she tested her own logic. And Callum had become part of the testing process. He would listen and ask the question that was actually useful, and she would consider it, and either adjust her argument or explain why the argument held, and either outcome was satisfying in its own way. Ilya would interrupt sometimes with a tangent that was only loosely connected to the topic at hand, and Sarath would give her sister a look that said we were discussing something else, and Ilya would give her a look that said yes, but this is more interesting. And sometimes Sarath conceded the point, and sometimes she did not, and the whole exchange would happen in about 3 seconds, with no words involved. He was beginning to understand the vocabulary of their looks and silences and small gestures, the private language that 8 years of working together had built between them. He was not fluent in it. He suspected he never would be, but he could recognize some of the words now, enough to follow the conversation, even when it was happening in a register he could not speak. He thought about all of this on the 30th day, sitting in the workshop after the last diagnostic of the evening cycle, the station quiet around him. He thought about how strange it was that the biggest changes in a person's life could happen without any visible event to mark them. No explosion, no emergency, no dramatic moment of revelation, just a slow accumulation of small things, each one insignificant on its own, that added up to a weight you could not set down and did not want to. He had not kissed either of them. He had not held either of them. The closest they had come to physical contact was Sarath's fingers on his shoulder seal after the Eva repair, and Ilya's shoulder against his on the observation deck. And yet he felt closer to both of them than he had felt to people he had known for years. The closeness was not physical. It was something else, something built out of attention and precision and the willingness to say the true thing, and the patience to sit with the silence that followed. He wondered, sometimes, whether this was how the Venari did things, whether the slow, careful approach was cultural, a function of a species that valued precision over speed and observation over action, or whether it was specific to these two women, to Sarath with her layered architecture and Ilya with her direct clarity, and to the particular dynamic that existed between them and that they were now, carefully and deliberately, extending to include him. He did not ask. The question would answer itself in time, and in the meantime, the days continued, and each one added something to the picture, and the picture kept getting clearer. He fixed the secondary waste processing unit on the 32nd day, using the replacement part he had originally been saving for it before the shower latch took priority. The repair took most of the afternoon and left him covered in the particular chemical residue that the waste system produced when its seals were compromised, which was deeply unpleasant but not dangerous. He showered on level 3 afterward, and the latch held, and he stood under the scalding water and thought about the 9th day and almost smiled. He ate dinner with both sisters that evening, and Ilya wrinkled her nose at the chemical smell that still clung to his hair despite the shower, and Sarath, without looking up from her data tablet, that the olfactory threshold for the Venari was approximately 3 times more sensitive than the human baseline, and that she appreciated his effort to mitigate the situation, even if the mitigation had been incomplete. He looked at her. She did not look up. The corner of her mouth moved, barely, and he recognized the motion as the thing he had been learning to recognize for 5 weeks now. The Venari smile that was not quite a smile, the warmth that lived underneath the precision. Ilya made the low, involuntary sound, the one that meant genuine amusement, and Sarath did not react. in the way that was distinctly different from not reacting. These were the moments he collected. These were the small things that filled the log he was not writing, but was keeping in his memory. The daily record of a life that had changed shape and was still changing and would keep changing until the 40 days were over. And the ship came, and the question of what came after could no longer be deferred. On the 35th day, with 5 days left in the assignment, Callum was in the workshop, running the last drone diagnostic of the cycle when both sisters appeared in the doorway together. This was unusual. In the middle of the day, they were generally in different parts of the station. Sareth in the survey room, Ilya in the data lab, or the galley, or one of the observation ports where she liked to read. They did not move as a unit during working hours. Their synchrony was deeper than proximity. They did not need to be in the same room to be coordinated. The fact that they were both standing in his workshop door in the middle of the afternoon meant something. He looked up from the drone he was calibrating. "The report is done," Sareth said. "The preliminary draft," Ilya said. Sareth considered this for a moment. "The report is done," she said again. Ilya gave Callum a look that communicated, with remarkable efficiency, the sentiment "she always does this," and he pressed his mouth flat against the impulse to smile and said, "Congratulations. We would like," Sareth said, with the careful precision she used for statements she considered important, "to use the observation deck this evening. Among the Venari, the completion of a significant piece of work calls for a marking, a small acknowledgement that the work is finished and that it is real. The observation deck is yours," he said. "We would like," she continued, in the same precise tone, "for you to be there." He put down the calibration tool and looked at her, and then at Ilya, and then back at Sareth. The gold eyes were steady. Ilya's expression was the closest thing to openly warm that he had seen from her, which on a Venari face meant a softening around the eyes and a stillness in the mouth that was different from her usual stillness. "All right," he said. "I will be there." The marking turned out to be a quiet thing. The three of them on the observation deck. The lights turned very low, lower than the standard nighttime setting, low enough that the stars outside the port were the brightest things in the room. Ilya produced a small glass jar from somewhere in her equipment case, a container he had not seen before, filled with a liquid that had a faint, pale luminescence to it, a soft glow that was visible in the dim light like a candle seen through water. "Venari spirit," Ilya said. She poured 3 into 3 small cups that she had also produced from the equipment case, clear glass with a weight to them that suggested they were meant for exactly this purpose. She handed one to Callum and one to Sareth and kept one for herself. Sareth held her cup at the level of her chest and said something in Venari. The dual tone of her voice was more pronounced in her own language, the two tones weaving together with a complexity that the common tongue did not allow. And the words had a cadence to them that felt ceremonial without being stiff, a rhythm that had been spoken many times before and had been worn smooth by repetition. Then she translated for him. "This is what we made, and it is real, and it will last." They drank. The spirit tasted like cold water at first, clean and sharp, and then, a moment later, there was something else underneath it, something floral, or something that occupied the same space as floral, a warmth that spread from the throat outward, slow and steady, settling into the chest and then the limbs. It was not a strong drink. It did not produce the blurring effect that human alcohol did. It produced a clarity, or something that felt like clarity, a sharpening of the senses that made the stars outside the port seem brighter and the hum of the station seem more distinct and the warmth of the two people sitting beside him seem closer and more real. After a while, Ilya leaned sideways in her chair, and her shoulder came to rest against his. She left it there. The weight of it was warm through the fabric of her underlayer, steady and deliberate, and she did not explain it or acknowledge it or look at him when she did it. She simply leaned, and her shoulder was against his. And that was what it was. Sareth, on his other side, turned her hand over on the armrest between their two chairs, palm up, her fingers slightly open. The motion was small and unhurried, the kind of gesture that could have been absent or could have been intentional. And the fact that it was Sareth making it meant it was intentional, because Sareth did not do things absently. He looked at her hand for a moment, the deep blue of her skin, the faint luminous quality of it in the low light, the white of her sleeve where it met her wrist. He put his hand over hers. Her fingers closed around his, gently, with a pressure that was firm enough to be felt and light enough to be released. And neither of them said anything about it, and neither of them needed to. Outside the observation port, the unmapped sectors stretched past the glass, dark and vast, and full of things that had not yet been cataloged or named or understood. The survey drones ran their circuits as faint points of light moving through the black. The station kept itself alive in the way it always had, steady and dim and self-sufficient, the system cycling and the air moving and the heat holding, doing what it had been built to do without complaint or comment. And for a while, the three of them sat there, and the Venari spirit glowed faintly in their cups, and the stars did their work, and nothing was required of any of them but presence, the simple, sufficient fact of being in the same place at the same time with people who saw you clearly and did not look away. Callum held Sarah's hand and felt Ilya's shoulder against his and watched the dark outside the port and thought about the word Sarah had used, considerably, and the word Ilya had used, deliberate, and the sentence Sarah had spoken in Venari and then translated for him. This is what we made, and it is real, and it will last. He did not know yet if that was true. He did not know what the next 5 days would hold, or the days after that, or the months after that. He did not know what shape this thing would take when it was no longer contained by the walls of a station and the structure of a 40-day assignment. He did not know if what worked here, in this small space at the edge of everything, would work somewhere else, or under different conditions, or in the light of the ordinary world, where things were less clear and less quiet and less stripped down to their essentials. But he knew what he felt, and he knew what they felt, because they had told him, plainly, in the Venari way that did not soften or approximate or hedge, and the knowing was enough for now. The knowing was enough to sit with, in the low light, with the stars outside, and the spirit warm in his chest, and the weight of 2 deliberate choices pressing gently against him from either side. The resupply ship was due in 5 days. He knew it. They knew it. None of them mentioned it, and the not mentioning had its own quality, its own weight, a shared awareness that sat in the room with them like a fourth presence, quiet and patient and asking nothing. 5 days, he thought, and then 4, and then 3, and then the ship would come, and they would go, and he would be alone again in the station he had kept alive for 9 months, and the keeping would continue, because that was what he did. But the keeping would be different now. He knew that already. The keeping would carry something it had not carried before, a memory, a weight, a warmth. The stars burned outside the port, and the station hummed, and Sarah's hand was warm in his, and Ilya's shoulder was solid against him, and the Venari spirit glowed softly in their cups, and the evening was long and quiet and good. Chapter 5. The last 5 days had a particular quality to them, the quality of time that you were watching while you were living inside it, the slight self-consciousness of an ending you could see, approaching, close enough to feel but not close enough to touch, like a ship on the transit corridor that was visible on the monitors, but had not yet reached the docking range. Callum did not try to pack those days with things. He suspected they would have resisted being packed. They were not the kind of days that lent themselves to grand gestures or significant conversations or any of the other things that people sometimes tried to cram into the final hours of something they did not want to end. They were just days, 5 more days on Solace Station, with the work continuing and the meals at the same times and the observation deck in the evenings, and underneath all of it, the low, steady awareness of 5 days, 4 days, 3, which he did not say out loud and did not need to. They all knew. The knowledge sat in the station like a change in air pressure, present and constant and impossible to pretend away. But they did not talk about it directly, not at first, because talking about it would have given it a shape it did not yet need, and because there were other things to do, and the doing of them was its own kind of answer. On the 38th day, with 2 days remaining, Callum was in the galley in the mid-morning cycle when Sarah came in and sat down across from him. She was not carrying her data tablet. She was not carrying any of the equipment or documentation she usually had with her when she was in working mode. The survey reports and analysis files and the small stack of annotated printouts she produced when she was building an argument for the assessment. She sat down with nothing in her hands and nothing on the table between them except his coffee cup and the mild hum of the food unit cycling in the background. He looked at her and understood immediately that she was not here about the survey. The next survey rotation, she said. When is it? He said. 4 months. She folded her hands on the table, the motion precise and deliberate, the way all her motions were. The outer belt eastern sectors, stations 5 through 12. She paused. Solace is station 9. He looked at her. The gold eyes were steady and warm, and her expression was the careful, composed one she wore when she was about to say something she had thought about for a long time and wanted to get exactly right. This is, of course, the standard survey schedule, she said. The allocation is not yet finalized, but it could be, he said. Allocations can be requested, she said. There is precedent for survey officers requesting assignment to specific stations when there is a research justification. The Sector 12 anomaly is a valid justification. She paused again, an extended justification, if the anomaly warrants further investigation, which Ilya believes it does. Ilya believes it does, he said. Yes, the faintest shift in her voice, the warmth that he had learned to recognize underneath the precision. Ilya is frequently right about these things. It is one of the more reliable things about her. He thought about 4 months. He thought about the number and what it meant. 4 months alone on this station, with the drones and the automated systems and the coffee unit and the stars. 4 months of the same work he had been doing for 9 months before they arrived. The same maintenance logs and diagnostic runs and pressure fault repairs. 4 months of silence and routine and the slow, patient keeping of a place that was designed to be kept. He had done it before. He could do it again. That was not the question. The question was what the 4 months would feel like now, with the memory of 40 days inside them. The question was whether the station would feel the same when it held 1 person again, after it had held 3. The question was whether the silence would be the comfortable kind or the other kind, the kind that he had not known existed until it ended. I would put in a recommendation with the station director, he said. If that helped. Sareth looked at him for a long moment. The gold eyes were entirely warm, the controlled surface and the depth underneath it. The 2 layers that he had learned to see as a single thing rather than as a surface with something hidden behind it. She was not hiding. She was being precise. And the precision, when you understood it, was its own kind of openness. It would help, she said. Then I will do that, he said. She unfolded her hands and stood, and on her way past his chair. She did something she had not done before. She rested her hand on his shoulder. Brief, warm, deliberate. The weight of her palm through the fabric of his coverall, the press of her fingers, the particular quality of contact that was not casual and was not accidental and was not anything other than exactly what it was. A touch that meant I am telling you something with this, and what I am telling you is real. And then she was past him and through the galley door and down the corridor, and her footsteps faded into the hum of the station, and he sat there with his coffee and the ghost of her hand on his shoulder and thought about 4 months and what they would hold and what would come after them. Sareth ran a final sweep of the survey room terminals the next morning. She was pulling her personal data off the station's local servers, transferring files onto her drives with the same systematic care she brought to everything. He helped her because she had asked, and because it was the kind of work he understood, and because working alongside her in the survey room had become one of the things he would miss. They moved through the files methodically. She told him the archive protocols for the Sector 12 data, the directory structure, and the access codes, in case the expansion committee sent a follow-up request before the next rotation. He noted everything down, and the whole process was practical and competent and entirely ordinary, except that it was the last morning and they both knew it. At one point, she paused over a drive index and said, without looking up from the screen, "You will send the station reports to the same survey address for the next 4 months. That is the protocol," he said. The Sector 12 extended study proposal, when it is approved, will come from the same address, she said. The approval is expected within 6 weeks. He looked at the side of her face, the deep blue of her skin in the light from the data terminal, the white of her hair where the braid fell across her shoulder, the set of her jaw, composed and certain. "You have already submitted the request," he said. "I submitted it yesterday," she said. "The Sector 12 anomaly is a valid research justification, a beat. I may have also noted," she said, in the same measured tone, "that the station's technician had demonstrated exceptional facility with survey data and would be a useful resource for the extended study period." He was quiet for a moment. "You did not mention that," he said. No, she said. And there was something in her voice that he had not heard before. Not the warmth underneath the precision. Something more vulnerable than that. Something closer to the sound a person made when they had done a thing they were not entirely certain about, and were waiting to find out if the doing of it had been right. I wanted it to be done before I mentioned it. He understood. She had wanted it to be certain. She had wanted the proposal submitted, and the justification on record, and the request in the system before she told him, because she would not say a thing she could not deliver. That was who she was. Precision was not a habit for her. It was a principle. And the principle applied to everything, including this, especially this. Thank you, he said. The research justification is genuine, she said. I know, he said. Thank you anyway. She looked at him then, turning from the screen to face him, and the gold eyes were steady and warm, and carrying something that he recognized as trust. The trust of a person who had calculated the risk and decided it was worth taking, and was now standing on the other side of the decision and finding that the ground held. He held her gaze for a moment, and then she went back to the drive index, and he went back to helping her, and nothing more needed to be said about it. On the 39th morning, Callum woke early and lay in the dark of his quarters for a while before getting up. The station was running its pre-dawn cycle, the lights still at their lowest setting, the ventilation system cycling through its quiet nighttime rhythm. Through the thin wall of his quarters he could hear the faint hum of the atmospheric processor on level 2, the one he had recalibrated 3 weeks ago, running clean and steady the way it was supposed to. One day, after today, one more morning, and then the ship would come. He got up and ran the morning maintenance check the way he always did. Pressure seals, atmospheric levels, water reclamation status, drone fleet readiness, everything green, everything holding. The station did not know that something was ending. The station only knew its own systems and its own cycles, and the ongoing work of keeping the air breathable and the temperature stable and the lights on. The station would keep doing this, whether there were 3 people inside it, or 1 or none at all. That was what stations did. He made coffee. The coffee unit, in what he chose to interpret as a gesture of solidarity, produced something that was not only drinkable but actually good. He sat in the galley and drank it slowly, and watched the morning light cycle brighten through the corridor port. And he thought about all the mornings he had sat in this galley alone, and all the mornings he had sat here, with 2 women across from him, and how the same chair and the same table, and the same view through the same port could feel like entirely different places, depending on who was in them. Ilya spent the last afternoon in the workshop. She sat on the secondary workbench, the same spot she had occupied during her silent observation visits in the first week, while he ran a final drone diagnostic. But this time there was no silence. She talked. She talked about the inner belt survey rotation she and Sarath were scheduled for after this assignment, the stations they would pass through, the transit corridors and layover points, and the particular logistics of moving between installations in the outer belt, where the distances were long and the transit windows were narrow. She talked about the research questions she had flagged during the Solace assessment that were technically outside the scope of the assignment, but that she intended to pursue through informal channels if the committee approved the funding. She was animated in a way she was not always, not louder. That was not how it worked with Ilya. She did not get louder when she was energized. She got faster. The words came more quickly, following more threads at once, branching and reconnecting, and branching again in a way that was sometimes hard to follow but always interesting. He recognized it after a while as nervous energy, channeled through the thing she was most comfortable with, which was thinking out loud about work. He let her talk. He ran the diagnostic and listened and asked questions when they were useful and did not ask when they were not. He had learned, over 5 weeks, the difference between the questions that opened something up for her and the questions that closed something down, and he was careful with them. After a while, she ran down naturally and sat in silence for a bit, watching him finish the last drone check. The workshop was quiet. The drone on the bench hummed faintly as the diagnostic software cycled through its final tests. Outside the workshop port, the stars were visible in the gap between the station hull and the outer ring, bright and patient and unchanged. Callum, she said. He looked up. She had not used his given name before. They had been on surname ground for the entire assignment. Ward, with the occasional dropping of even that to simply technician. The way station language sometimes ran when people were focused on work and formality was an unnecessary expenditure of syllables. The given name sat differently in the air. It had a weight to it that the surname did not. It was personal in a way that acknowledged the personal nature of what was between them. "Ilya," he said. She was looking at him with the gold eyes and the full attention. The cataloging focus that had never been impersonal, that he understood now had never been impersonal. Not from the first day. Not from the moment she had stepped through the docking seal and surveyed the bay and looked at him with the expression he had spent 5 weeks learning to read. "We will come back," she said. "The Sector 12 research will be approved. Sarath does not submit requests that do not get approved." "I believe you," he said. "I am also telling you," she said carefully, choosing each word, "because I know that 4 months on a station alone is a long time, and I would like—" She paused. "I would like you to know that it is 4 months, not longer." He put down the diagnostic tool. He crossed the workshop to the secondary bench where she was sitting, and he stood in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to look at his face. And he said, "I know." She looked up at him. The gold eyes were very warm, the closest he had ever seen to unguarded. The focused attention softened by something that was not quite vulnerability and not quite tenderness, but occupied the space between the two. "I will be here," he said. "That is what I do." She made the sound, the barely audible low note, the involuntary one, the one that meant genuine amusement and that she never seemed to know she was making. And then she put one hand on his arm, briefly, the warm weight of her fingers through his sleeve. And then the weight was gone, and she was standing and walking past him toward the door. "Good," she said, over her shoulder. "Then we will see you in 4 months." She was gone. The workshop was quiet. The drone on the bench completed its diagnostic cycle and powered down. Callum stood there for a moment and looked at the place where she had been sitting and thought about the way she had said his name, the weight of it, the deliberateness. Then he finished the diagnostic log and closed up the workshop and went to his quarters and lay on his bunk and looked at the ceiling and thought about 4 months and how long they were and how short they were and how the measurement depended entirely on what you were measuring against. The resupply ship arrived on schedule the next morning. The Cavern sisters loaded their equipment cases, their data drives, their completed survey report with its flagged anomaly in Sector 12, and its research proposal for extended study. The small glass jar of Venari spirit, 3/4 empty now, went into Ilya's case with the cups wrapped carefully in field jacket fabric. The docking bay was bright with the standard arrival cycle lighting, and the air had the particular quality it always had when a ship was connected. The faint pressure differential and the smell of transit corridor atmosphere, mixing with the station's recycled air. Ilya hugged him. It turned out to be how the Venari did it, or at least how these Venari did it. 2 hands on his shoulders, her palms flat and firm. And then she stepped in close and pressed her forehead against his. A single exhale that was not quite words. A breath that carried the shape of something she might have said, if saying it would not have changed it into something less than what it was. He held still. He felt the warmth of her forehead against his and the weight of her hands on his shoulders, and the particular quality of the contact, which was not a human hug, and was not a handshake, and was not any other gesture he had a name for. It was a Venari thing, a Cavern thing, a thing that meant I am here, and you are here. And this moment is the bridge between the time we had and the time we will have, and I am crossing it with you. She stepped back. The gold eyes were bright and steady, and he thought he saw, in the fraction of a second before she turned away, the faintest shimmer at their edges that might have been moisture and might have been the light and might have been something else entirely. Sarath looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped forward and did the same thing. 2 hands on his shoulders, the press of her forehead against his. She held the contact a beat longer than Ilya had. 1 beat, enough to feel the difference, enough to feel the warmth of her skin against his and the steadiness of her breathing and the weight of everything she was not saying because she had already said it. In the survey room and the galley and the observation deck, and in a research proposal submitted to the expansion committee with a handwritten note about a station technician who was more than a station technician. He held still and felt the warmth of it and thought, 4 months. Then she stepped back, and the gold eyes were steady. and she nodded once. The short, efficient motion that was her signature. And she turned and walked through the docking seal and onto the ship. He watched them go. He stood at the bay monitors and tracked the ship as it undocked and pushed out toward the transit corridor. A slow, steady departure that the station's sensors followed automatically. He watched the ship's signal on the monitor, the small bright point moving away from the station's position marker, crossing the boundary of the local sensor range and entering the transit window. And then it was gone. The monitor showed empty space. The station's sensors returned to their default scan pattern, sweeping the local sectors for drone signals and transit traffic and the background radiation that was always there. The constant low hum of the universe going about its business. Callum stood in the quiet bay for a moment and let the station settle around him. The hum of the life support, the cycling of the ventilation, the automated click of the drone return bay as the afternoon survey unit came home from its circuit. The sounds of a station doing what it was built to do. The sounds he had lived with for 9 months before the sisters arrived and would live with for 4 months more. The sounds were the same. The station was the same. The metal and the glass and the recycled air and the stars outside the port, all unchanged. All exactly as they had been on the day he arrived and on every day since. But the quality of occupancy was different. The station that held 1 person after holding 3 was not the same station it had been before it held 3. The silence was not the same silence. It was not the comfortable, clean silence of a person who was alone because alone was his natural state. It was the silence of a person who had learned what the alternative sounded like and was carrying the memory of it. He went inside. He sat at the comm terminal and submitted his station report, the standard end-of-visit documentation that the authority required whenever temporary personnel completed an assignment and departed. He included all the usual information: dates, personnel names, purpose of visit, summary of activities conducted, status of station systems at departure. Then he wrote a handwritten addendum, not on the terminal, not in the standard report format, but on a separate sheet, in his own handwriting, addressed to the survey director. He noted the exceptional quality of the assessment conducted by Senior Survey Officer Sarath Kavran and Officer Ilya Kavran. He noted the thoroughness of their work and the precision of their methodology, and the value of the Sector 12 anomaly they had identified. He recommended the anomaly as a priority for extended study by experienced survey personnel. He wrote it carefully. He said what he meant, which was that the work had been first-rate, which was true, and which was the kind of thing the survey director needed to know, and which had nothing to do with the other things that were also true, because those were not the survey director's business. The other things, the shower on the 9th day and the eyes that did not look away, the observation deck and I made a choice. It was deliberate. The survey room and you looked like a person who knew what he was. The tether line and the pressure seal and the touch that lasted a beat longer than the check required. The marking and the spirit and the hand turned palm up on the armrest and the forehead pressed against his in the docking bay. Those things were his and theirs and nobody else's. He sealed the addendum and attached it to the report and submitted the whole package through the comm relay and went to level 3 and showered. The latch held. It held perfectly, the way it had held every day since the 10th day when he had fixed it, because he had fixed it properly, with a good part and clean installation and the attention of a person who believed that fixing things right mattered even when no one was checking. He stood under the water for a long time. The station's hot water supply was reliable. This was one of its virtues, one of the things that worked well and had always worked well. And he let the heat do its work on his shoulders and his back, and the tension he had not realized he was carrying until the departure was over. And the tension had nowhere left to go except out. He thought about 40 days and what 40 days could hold. He thought about the 9th day and a door swinging open and 2 women standing in the light and the quality of not turning away. The deliberateness of it, which he understood now better than he had then. He thought about Sarath's hand on the tether controls, smooth and certain, tracking him across the dark side of the hull, while the cold crept through his suit and the stars burned around him. He thought about Ilya at the observation port with her shoulder against his, watching the survey drone's running lights blink red, white, red through the unmapped sectors. He thought about a dead station in the inner belt and a handwritten log that someone had kept for 2 years, filling it with small things. daily things. Things that only mattered because someone was there to notice them. He thought, I kept it going until the next people arrived. That is what I do. That is what I am good at, he thought. 4 months. Outside the port, the stars proceeded with their ordinary business. The survey drones completed their circuits. The station kept itself alive in the way it always had, steady and dim and self-sufficient, waiting as it had always waited for the next ship to come in. This time, he knew which ship he was waiting for. He knew the names of the people on it and the color of their eyes and the way they looked at the stars in the late cycle when the work was done. He knew the sound that Ilya made when she was genuinely amused, the involuntary low note that she did not know she was making. He knew the particular quality of Sereth's silence when she had already decided something, the controlled stillness that was not hesitation but certainty, waiting for the right moment to speak. He knew these things and they were his, and they would be there in 4 months when the ship came back, because the things you learned by paying attention did not go away. They stayed. They became part of the keeping. He turned off the water and got dressed and went to his quarters and lay down on his bunk and closed his eyes. He slept well, which meant something different than it had 9 months ago, and considerably better.